And thanks, Rachel, for giving us time to talk today during today's session. We're very excited to talk about the Digital Equity Act. So for some context, I have been working alongside my colleagues Catalina and Judy Morcrude on a new project from World Education called Transforming Immigrant Digital Equity, or TIDE, and you can find more information about that project on the EdTech Center website. But one of the main branches of this project is advocacy around the Digital Equity Act. And so that is the focus of today's session. So what exactly is the Digital Equity Act? The Digital Equity Act is part of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law that was passed last November. And it allocates $2.75 billion in spending over 5 years. All of that funding is being administered through the Department of Commerce's National Telecommunications and Information Administration, otherwise known as the NTIA. And there is a link to the full text if you'd like to read a little bit about that over the weekend. So what is the imperative behind digital equity? Or rather, what does Congress say is the imperative behind digital equity? So in the Digital Equity Act, Congress makes the following case: that first, broadband and digital literacy are critical to participating in US systems and accessing essential services such as public benefits. 2, that digital exclusion is harmful and exacerbates existing wealth and income gaps. 3, that there is a need for additional and sustained investment and research in digital equity. 4, that federal, state, local, tribal, and other governments have social, legal, and economic obligations that extend to how their citizens and how their residents access and use the internet. And lastly, number 5, that digital equity is a matter of social and economic justice. And as you can imagine, this kind of language is actually very encouraging and rewarding to hear from Congress. The Digital Equity Act also lays out 3 important definitions for digital literacy, digital equity, and digital inclusion. Oftentimes, when we talk about digital literacy, there is a tendency to conflate these terms or to use them in different ways. And this kind of helps set standardized definitions for all of us to be able to communicate with each other and to define our work. So digital literacy is defined as the skills that are associated with using technology to enable users to find, evaluate, organize, create, and communicate information. Digital equity is the condition in which individuals and communities have the IT capacity that is needed for full participation in the society and economy of the United States. And then the definition for digital inclusion is a little bit longer. It includes several different elements, including affordable access to and the use of reliable broadband, internet-enabled devices, as well as applications and online content. And then there's also digital literacy training, quality technical support, as well as knowledge to ensure someone's online privacy and cybersecurity. So the way we like to think of it is that all of these digital inclusion activities that I just mentioned will lead to the state of digital equity. So the big question is, where is all the money going? And to that end, Digital Equity Act funding is going into 2 streams, one for states and one for non-state entities. And so we'll talk more about the state funding first, because that is what is coming down the pipeline first. In order to be eligible for Digital Equity Act funding, interested states first have to appoint an administering entity to oversee the planning and implementation of Digital Equity Act funding. And that is the responsibility of each state's governor. And we'll talk a little bit more about who's eligible to become an administering entity in a later slide. Then states have to apply for planning funds and develop their state digital equity plan over the course of a year. And lastly, submit that state digital equity plan for formula funding via the State Digital Equity Capacity Grant, which allocates $1.44 billion over 5 years. That formula funding takes into account the total number of individuals within that state, specifically also the total number of individuals that fall into the covered populations category, as well as the state's relative lack of availability and adoption of broadband service. So in terms of where we are with regards to the timeline, right now we're waiting for the notice of funding opportunity to come out for the State Digital Equity Planning Grant, and that is expected out in late May 2022. And that will allocate $60 million to states in order for them to develop their digital equity plan again over the course of a year. States will have 60 days to respond to that notice of funding opportunity and apply for those funds. So what is in the state digital equity plan? The state digital equity plan has 5 main components. So first of all, the plan has to include all of the barriers to digital equity that the covered populations face within the state. The plan also has to include measurable objectives for documenting and promoting broadband access, online accessibility of public services, digital literacy, individual online privacy and cybersecurity, and the availability and affordability of consumer devices and technical support. The plan also has to include assessment of how all of those above objectives will impact and interact with the state's goals, including their economic and workforce development goals, plans and outcomes, educational outcomes, health outcomes, civic and social engagement, and delivery of other essential services. So really taking a holistic look at how digital literacy and digital equity impact somebody's ability to participate in both society and the economy. And lastly, there is a huge focus on collaboration. So each plan has to include a description of how the state will collaborate with key stakeholders to achieve all of those objectives above. And as you can see, who qualifies as key stakeholders, that includes a variety of different entities, including community anchor institutions, nonprofit organizations, organizations that represent the people that fall under covered populations, state agencies that administer adult education activities, so the State Adult Education Office, public housing authorities, and other agencies that you may be part of. And to that end, to show that states are collaborating with key stakeholders, the state also has to include a list of organizations with which they are actually collaborating with on the digital equity plan. So let's take a little bit of time to look at who is actually eligible to become an administering entity. The administering entity, which again will be decided by the state's governor, is responsible for developing, implementing, and overseeing the state digital equity plan. And they can also make subgrants to the key stakeholders that I just mentioned, who can support the state digital equity plan and those digital inclusion activities. So the administering entity can be the state itself. We're seeing that probably a lot of states will go in the way of their broadband office. But entities that are also eligible include non-school not-for-profits, community anchor institutions, workforce development program providers, local education agencies, and again, state agencies that administer adult education activities. And to further clarify the definition of a community anchor institution, so the Digital Equity Act defines that as a public school, a public or multifamily housing authority, library, medical or healthcare provider, community college or other institution of higher education, state library agency, and any other nonprofit or governmental community support organization. So I would wager that pretty much all of us fall into at least one of these categories that have been mentioned so far. So when I talk about covered populations, who am I actually referring to? So there's a broad definition of who's covered. First of all, in terms of the households that are covered, the Digital Equity Act defines those households as at or below 150% of the federal poverty level. And then for covered populations, that encompasses the individuals who live in those households, as well as aging individuals, incarcerated individuals other than those who are incarcerated in a federal correctional facility, veterans, individuals with disabilities, individuals with a language barrier, individuals who are members of a racial or ethnic minority group, and individuals who primarily reside in a rural area. So all of those populations are prioritized under the Digital Equity Act. And in terms of implications for immigrants and refugees, it's encouraging to see that the Digital Equity Act explicitly covers individuals with a language barrier, including individuals who are either English learners and or have low levels of literacy. And of course, many of the learners that we serve also fall into multiple covered categories. So it's important that we are able to identify and advocate for those learners. Taking a step back from all of the state funding, so again, thinking about the planning grant money coming out in May 2022, and then states having a year to write their state digital equity plan, then to submit it for the capacity grant funding. We're looking at the other non-state funding coming out at 2023 at the very, very earliest. So this funding would come out through the Digital Equity Competitive Grant, which allocates $1.25 billion over 5 years. And that funding will only open after all of the state capacity grants have been awarded. In terms of who's eligible to apply for this funding, and again, it's competitive funding, so no formula funding. That includes community anchor institutions, again, as well as local education agencies, entities that carry out workforce development programs, and partnerships between or among any of these entities that are mentioned in this list. So even though the planning grant funding is coming out in May, right now, we strongly encourage that you don't wait until May to get started in terms of advocacy and thinking about how your organization can get involved. In terms of what you can do right now, it's really important to start building those relationships with your state and local representatives and offices to make sure that your voice and your students' voices are heard, and to start building relationships with other potential digital equity partners in your area, because no one can do all of those digital inclusion elements by themselves, and we don't want to duplicate any of that work. So start building those connections and thinking about how you can leverage each other's expertise. Very importantly, educate your network, so other adult education providers and also other community organizations, about the Digital Equity Act. This slide segment that I showed right now is actually just a small part of a fuller deck that is available on the EdTech website. You can use those slides to educate anyone in your network about the Digital Equity Act funding and what people can do in order to advocate for their constituents. And when that state planning NOFO finally comes out in May 2022, remember to advocate for immigrants and refugees and your students to be fully represented in the digital equity plan. Make sure that community anchor institutions who serve covered populations are at that planning leadership table and are able to receive funding. We want to highlight existing trusted models of digital equity services and the expertise of organizations that have been serving these covered populations for decades. And we want to make sure that all aspects of digital inclusion, especially digital literacy, are included. When the NOFO comes out, we as World Education will also be releasing some guidance on the state digital equity plan and talking points that you can use.